St. Mark's, may the peace of Christ be with you all. The new academic school year has officially begun, and for some of you that might be good news, while for others not so much. LA Unified School District began back on August 11th, Palos Verdes School District began on August 20th, and Torrance Unified and Manhattan Beach Unified both started on August 21st. There are a few exceptions, however. For example, college and universities, UCLA, UC Irvine, for example, they both start late September, but for the vast majority of students, the new school year is underway. For students heading back to school, there's so many things to consider, whether you're just starting in kindergarten or even heading off to college. And last week we talked about how the brand new school year is an opportunity for fresh starts, how the old has passed away, as in the old report cards, and how the new has come, and with it, new opportunities. Every new school year is like a clean slate, a brand new, untouched canvas, and you get to decide how the year is going to unfold. Having said that, I cannot imagine what it must be like to be a student today, because it sure seems like there's a lot of more things going on in the schools today. There's not only the academic pressure of getting good grades and doing well on tests, there's also the issue of school safety, which wasn't a thing a generation ago. Then, as if that wasn't enough, just worrying about good grades and about being safe, there's also the added pressure of navigating all the social issues that up to this point, no generation has ever experienced. For teenagers, especially, this can be a very tricky time. There's a famous psychologist by the name of Erik Erikson. He's the one who came up with the famous life cycle theory. And he said that especially for teenagers, a big part of their self-identity is connected to their sense of belonging. Well, for most children, as they are growing up, their sense of belonging is connected to home and to parents and siblings. But as those children become teenagers, their sense of belonging shifts away from home and their parents and is more connected to friends and peers. In other words, for teenagers, their friendships and classmates start to have more influence than parents used to have. Just a tip for parents of teenagers, so when that starts to happen, don't be alarmed. That makes it even more important for teenagers, as they go back to school, to meet good friends and to make good friendships. And so sometimes, in the hopes of being accepted and being liked by your peers, some students will try to blend in and not stand out in the crowd, especially if you're a new student and trying to fit in. Sometimes it's easier. It's just a lot easier to follow the crowd. Take a look at this first picture, which is meant to be kind of lighthearted. Kind of hard to see the details, but it's a picture of a random school where all the boys in the picture seem to be dressed exactly the same. They're wearing polo shirts, khaki shorts, penny loafers, no socks, I might add, along with the black backpacks. It's as if that is the unofficial school uniform. Imagine showing up to school and everyone's dressed like this. Guess how you're probably going to dress the next day. Here's another fun picture of a college campus event where almost all the girls showed up in very similar outfits. A black vest over a white long sleeve, dark leggings, and boots. And it's not just the three girls in the front, but all the girls behind are almost dressed exactly the same. These pictures are meant to poke fun of how sometimes in the effort to blend in, students will show up to school dressed like everybody else. Thanks for the picture. If you're joining us for the first time this morning, we started a new sermon series called Back to School, where I want to start with a school topic that students might be able to relate with, and then to take that topic and apply it to the rest of us in a way where we can all connect with this series. This morning's topic is on peer pressure, about wanting to be accepted. It's about trying to fit in or blend in with the crowds. And in our passage for today, we'll listen to the words of the Apostle Paul as he addressed Christians in Rome who were struggling with the same issue. They were trying to fit in with the rest of society. They were trying to blend in and be part of the crowd, but they got so good at it to the point that Paul couldn't tell them apart from non-Christians, and so in the passage he encouraged them to stand out. Our passage for this morning comes from Romans chapter 12, verse 2. I'd like to read the NIV translation first, followed by the Message translation afterwards. Romans chapter 12, verse 2, let us prepare our hearts and minds for the reading of God's word. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And now the Message translation. Don't be so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There's a famous phrase that you may have heard before. I'll put the first part up on the screen, and if you know how it ends, go ahead and shout it out. When in Rome, can you show the second one? Do as the Romans do. I think all of you know this phrase. You're familiar with it. Did you know that even though this phrase is not in the Bible, it has a religious origin? When in Rome, do as the Romans do. It's a particularly interesting phrase because we're studying a verse from the book of Romans written by Paul. I've actually been to Rome. I went there many years ago with my wife, but while we were there, we never heard anyone say that phrase before. Go ahead and keep it up on the screen for a while. No one ever came up to us and said, travelers from America, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. I can tell you, however, that my first impression of Rome and Roman citizens were, man, everyone here is dressed so well. For example, just as we stepped outside our hotel, there was someone on a bicycle just riding his bike right past us, and he was in a three-piece suit. Then there was another guy standing at the bus stop waiting to catch a bus. Again, a three-piece suit. The waiter who took our order at the restaurant was dressed like he was the owner, and it wasn't just about the formal wear, but the colors that the Italians wore. So on our trip to Rome, I wanted to dress like the Romans, and I dragged my wife into every single suit store. When in Rome, dress like the Romans dress. Is that what the phrase means? Not so much. The origin of the quote actually had nothing to do with men's fashion. Would you be surprised to know that it actually had to do with fasting? Fasting. There were these two bishops. I'm going to tell you the origin of this story, this phrase. There are two bishops back in the 4th century. Here's a painting of the two of them. The artist's name is Pedro Barraguet. St. Ambrose, The one on the left was the Bishop of Milan, and St. Augustine, the one on the right, was the Bishop of Hippo. The two bishops were good friends, and from time to time, as bishops have to do, they have to travel to other cities or countries to perform their religious duties. Well, there was this one time St. Augustine was traveling to Rome, and he noticed that all of the Christians in Rome fasted on Saturdays, which was not his custom back in Hippo. And so, not knowing what to do, do I fast, do I not fast, St. Augustine wrote to St. Ambrose asking for his advice, and this is what St. Ambrose said. When I am here back in Milan, I do not fast on Saturdays, but when in Rome, I do fast on Saturdays. So, follow the custom of whatever church you attend in that city. That famous exchange between the two bishops was recorded in St. Augustine's book entitled Confessions, and as that story was told over and over and over again by Christians, a simplified version of St. Ambrose's response emerged. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. That phrase today has obviously moved on and moved away from its religious origins, and today if someone were to say it, it's usually given as traveling advice to follow the local customs, right? For example, if you were in Japan and someone were to say, in Japan, do as the Japanese do, that could mean many things, but one thing for sure is to stand on the left side as you are going up the escalator, while those who are in a hurry can run past you on the right side. Or if you were in a different country whose dress code may be a little bit more conservative, it might be a good idea to leave the shorts and the tank tops back at home. In some countries, it would be offensive to leave a tip after a meal. In other countries, walking with your hands in your pocket is a big social no-no. Did you know that in some countries, giving someone a thumbs up is like holding up the middle finger? So those of you who want to say, Pastor Billy, you're doing a great job, I don't know what country you're saying that in. All this to say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. That's great advice for travelers who want to follow the local customs. But in our passage, the Apostle Paul said something almost the opposite. He wasn't giving traveling advice to the Christians who were vacationing in Rome, because when he finally got to Rome and was placed under house arrest, how he saw the Christians living in Rome, it was so hard to tell them apart. Perhaps the Christians who were living in Rome had become so adjusted to life in the big city that when Paul looked out at them, they were just like everybody else. So in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, Paul said it this way, "Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world." Or the Message translation, don't be so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. When Paul said, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, he assumed that his readers knew what those Roman patterns were. Apparently, in Roman culture, there was a pattern, there was a Roman lifestyle that didn't sit well with Paul. Rome was the center of power and status, and everything else was below it. Have you heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome? You know, if we were to say all roads lead to Lomita or all roads lead to St. Mark's, can you imagine the audacity of coming up with a phrase like that? But Rome did. And all the roads apparently did lead to Rome. And so that phrase implied Rome was kind of the epicenter of the world. So those who lived in Rome, they had kind of this elite self-image, if you will, where power and status, title, rank, and hierarchy was very important. A few things also to know about Rome. Rome was also a very violent city. The Roman legal code was very harsh. They didn't have extensive prison systems where people were put away for life. Punishment was swift and severe. Rome also was, you could say, a morally confused or corrupt city. It wasn't necessarily the original sin city, but Rome was where you went if you had a lot of vices, shall we say. So the patterns of the world, the patterns of Rome that Paul was alluding to, wasn't necessarily healthy if you were living there as a Christian, and Paul started to notice that Christians blended in a little bit too well. That's a little bit of the history there, the context, original context. So, what does this passage mean for us today? 2,000 plus years later, 6,000 plus miles away from Rome, what do Paul's words mean for Christians here today? Well, going back to students, consider the struggle for students going back to school who might be wondering, how do I blend in? And also the opposite, how do I stand out? For the rest of us, we might say it this way: how can I be in the world, but not of the world? That's the challenge, isn't it? There's a picture I want to show you, if you could put it up above me. It says, the caption reads, "Blending in. Sometimes your life depends on it." I wish I could zoom in, but it's a picture of looks like a pack of dogs, a pack of hounds, and there, right in the center, there's a fox blending right in. Blending in. Sometimes your life depends on it. Well, that was definitely true for early Christians. Not long after the resurrection of Christ, they had to keep their identities hidden and blend in with the rest of society. You didn't wear a cross necklace around your neck. You didn't put a Christian bumper sticker with your favorite Bible verse on your car. You didn't want anyone to know you were a follower of Christ, and that's because Christians were persecuted. But that was a long time ago. What about today? How can Christians blend in, so to speak, not as a matter of survival, but as a means of connecting with the rest of the world? Well, for starters, Jesus gave us a few examples of how to blend in with the world when he called his first disciples. He went to a group of fishermen, people from the working class. He even called a tax collector, people who weren't that popular. He connected with people who didn't draw a lot of attention and blended in with those right under the radar. Jesus blended in so well during those 3 years in ministry that when an armed group of soldiers came to arrest him that night in the garden, Judas had to come up with a signal to help identify who it was. Otherwise, the soldiers wouldn't have known who to arrest. In some ways, Christians today are called to blend in, to be part of the world so that in some way we might save it. Paul said it this way: "To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some." I wish we could ask our teenagers, what does that verse sound like as you're going back to school? And then to the rest of us, what does that verse sound like as a neighbor, as a coworker? How can you blend in a way where blending in is not a matter of survival, but a means to making connections, especially connecting others to Christ? Well, the flip side of blending in is standing out. And I want to share that not all students feel pressure to blend in. There's a lot of students who also want to stand out and be unique. How can we stand out as Christians in a way that sticks up for Jesus? Here's another picture I have to show you. The next one. It's a picture of a famous meme where the caption reads, "Stop trying to fit in. You were made to stand out." Leave it up there for a second. Did you know that there were several things that made the early Christians stand out, stand apart from others? The book of Acts records the early Christian community doing some very radical and unusual things. For instance, when they all got together, they shared their possessions. Acts chapter 4, verse 32. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions were their own, but they shared everything they had. The early Christian community stood out for their radical sense of community. Imagine if we were that radical today. The early Christian community also stood out as being the ones who visited people who were in prison. Prison visitations were almost uniquely a Christian activity. Prisoners didn't have visitors, not even their own family members, because of the stigma and shame attached to it. But if someone in your church were locked up in jail, you brought food, medicine, and clothing to let them know that they were not alone. Early Christians also stood out in the way that they took care of other people, and necessarily, in particular, those who were sick. Do you wonder why so many area hospitals have religious names? Here's just a few. Little Company of Mary, Good Samaritan Hospital, St. John's, St. Joseph's, St. Vincent's, Cedar Sinai, Trinity Health, and even on the East Coast, New York Presbyterian, just to name a few off the top of my head. That's because Christians were the first ones to establish hospitals. Back then, if you went to a hospital, you knew right away you were being treated by a Christian because that's how they stood out. They cared for those who were sick. We were made to stand out. We were made to stand apart. You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 26. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. St. Mark's, as you go into this week, I hope you find ways to stand out and other times to blend in ways that honors God. Know that students are struggling with the same thing as they navigate their first few weeks of school. May you find ways to blend in and become all things to all people, and also find ways to stand out that shines a light on Christ. And all God's people said,